about the priorities so we can turn it over to Ana Lugo.
Great. Welcome, Ana.
Good morning. I am so both grateful and excited to be here. And Angie, actually, if you can get us out of the PowerPoint so that we are able to see everyone in their amazingness. Good morning, Socorro. This is how I get to see my friends. I need to come present at meetings.
Good morning.
I was telling Nora earlier that I've done this, held the container for these types of conversations all over the state, and I've never been so nervous because it is home, right? I'm home and I get to do this here. So I'm just gonna own that I'm nervous, and then we'll go from there because then it'll go away once I actually get into it. But I wanna start by really setting the foundation with getting us all present. I know that we all have a million things happening. So to the best of our ability, if in the next 45 to an hour, we can put our phones down, turn them around, right? Get into the room, take a very deep breath, you know, get to this morning and this place and this space so that we can create the type of energy that we want to see in the world, right? So this space really is about healing. And my job here is to create a container where you all feel safe to be the one thing that this country tells us is unacceptable to be, and that is vulnerable. And so my job is to model that for you, hence why I'm telling you that I'm nervous. And to invite you to have the courage to also be in that space for me. So we will keep it both intellectual, but also go down into our bodies and into the emotions that come with talking about the topics of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and belonging, right? So it is a combination. Take a deep breath, plant your feet on the floor, get excited because this is a really good conversation to be having in Sonoma County. As Oscar said, we have talked about equity for over a decade, and so we're still talking about it. So how do we actually get to the action piece of this, right? Because I don't know about you, but at some point, I wanna actually see some action, right? We've talked about it long enough. It's a full-grown baby at this point. So let's talk about how we actually get to some action. So with that, I'm gonna ask Angie to get us back into the PowerPoint. And you can go to the next slide, Angie. And so I do wanna start by honoring the fact that we are standing on land, right? And we are occupying land that was once fostered and cared for by our Native American brothers and sisters who have suffered major violence at the hands of our society. And so it is important that we honor that. And so I want to ground us in this piece in Lakesh, because this is what our conversation is really going to be about today. Tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo. I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love you and respect you, me amo y respeto yo. I love and respect myself. So that is the container we want to create today. And with that comes having some agreements. So if you go to this next slide, Angie. And what we're doing here really is stepping into brave space, right? It takes courage to be vulnerable. And so I just want you to sit with these agreements. I'm gonna read through them. I want you to really notice what comes up for you. And then at the end, I want you to answer the question, what else do I need to have as part of the agreement for me to feel safe in having this conversation? So the first one is there will be different viewpoints, and that is okay. The world is full of opinions, and the single most important thing is that we're able to communicate them in a way that honors each of our realities. Own the intention and impact of your statements, right? Sometimes we say things without thinking and they impact other people. So we want to be able to own that. Step up and step back. There are people like me who love to talk, hence why I'm good at doing this kind of work. And then there are people that need time to process. And so I'm going to encourage these people to step up. And then those of us who talk a lot, Jenny Lynn, to step back a little bit, right? I'm actually, I'll preface this by saying I love to have fun in my work. I don't like to do things where I don't have fun. So I will joke around with you all. And that's part of the beauty of creating a safe space. lean into discomfort. These conversations are uncomfortable. We all have biases. We all have belief systems that are going to be stretched and challenged. And so it is okay to be uncomfortable. Discomfort is not the absence of safety. So I just want you to hold that. But that I'll also say, if at any point you feel really, really uncomfortable and need to go take care of yourself, please do so. Actively listen to understand, right? Don't listen to respond, listen to understand. Those are two very different things. We're not in an intellectual competition. This is not about who knows the most about equity, who knows the most about diversity. This is about learning together. I am certainly not the expert. Throughout the world, we're trying to figure out how to do this well, how to do this better, how to change systems. So I can tell you that no one in this room is fully the expert. It is okay to challenge with care. If someone says something that lands with you in a certain way, go ahead and talk about it. Keep language simple. No need for jargon, right? It is okay to use simple language. We're very smart people. We know and acknowledge that. I see it. Let's use simple language. Notice and name group dynamics, right? Sometimes things are happening. I'd rather we not go off and talk behind each other's backs. Like, let's bring it into the conversation. Let's be direct and let's be honest. Tell your experience, not my story. As I thought about the fact that this meeting is going on public record, I really had to reckon with the fact that confidentiality isn't really an option, right, for the things we say here today. But it is important that as we go on, we tell our own experience of what happened here today, not the stories that other people brought to the room. And let's get curious about reactions, right? They are linked to beliefs. So if you're uncomfortable, that means that there's a belief system there. So let's get curious about what that is. And let's work to recognize our privilege. By virtue of being in this meeting, we have privilege, and so we have to be able to own that. With that, I will turn it back to you all and ask, what else do you need to feel safe? Anything on here that you want to talk about or explore further or have questions about? No?
Looks good to me, Anna.
Awesome. This is an interactive conversation. This is not a one-way presentation, and you are all talkative, so I'm expecting a lot of interaction, okay? I want Angie to say, you guys gotta stop because we gotta move on. So with that, I can see all of you, and I would love your thumbs up if you're able to agree to this so that we can move forward with the conversation. Awesome. Staff as well, Moira. We are all in this community. Michelle Ryers, I don't see her. There she is. So as much as we can keep our cameras on, this is really about building community. We all have things we have to do, but as much as we can all be in this space with each other, that'll be amazing. Okay, we're moving on. That's Angie's cue. Keep moving. We are basing this conversation on anti-racism, on the 3 pillars of diversity, equity, and belonging. And it really is the active celebration and utilization of our unique and collective identities, experiences, knowledge, and wisdom to transform and evolve communities, institutions, and systems to meet our needs and provide resources in order to live full, healthy, thriving lives, be full participants of, and make demands upon the communities we live in. So that is what we're doing, right? That is our job, to figure how to do this based on the celebration of who we are as individuals and also as a collective. So we really are merging the individualism aspects of the American society with collective aspects of other societies, right? I come from Mexico, we're a collectivist culture, so that is something that I understand. Any questions so far? Any comments? We ready to move on? Awesome. Anti-racism, right? So how do we get to anti-racism through diversity, equity, and belonging? And so what is anti-racism? And that is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So with this, I want to talk about, I know that we got a couple of comments around the word anti-racism not being on the statement which you guys received. And I just want to have the conversation about what does anti-racism bring up for you? Nora.
I think for me, it brings up really active behavior, actively calling out what you're seeing, actively working against racism. As it's in opposition to kind of passive, racism or passive anti-racism, I guess. The idea that, silence is violence, and I think part of the conversation we've been having as a nation recently, that many of us are benefiting from systems that actively oppress others. And unless we stand up against those systems, nothing's going to change.
What happens when we have to become anti-racist within our own families?
I think you can make yours, depending on your family, you can make yourself unpopular or pariah or get labeled, a radical or, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on the kind of politics and background of your people in your family.
Exactly. Or in our friendship circles, right?
Right.
So there's a recognition that it's really easy to talk about anti-racism when we're talking about the nation, or when we're talking about the state, or when we're talking about the county, or when we're talking about Santa Rosa City Schools or Sonoma Valley Unified Schools, right? It's so easy to talk about it when we're talking about systems, but the truth of the matter is where the rubber meets the road is when we have to talk to people we love about the fact that the words they're using are furthering the violence against some people, right? And so wherever we land on this spectrum, it is important to also know that it is a very challenging journey that isn't only happening at the table of the First Five Commission, right? To truly be an anti-racist and to truly be an anti-racism organization, it has to happen in your own personal life. And there has to be personal accountability within each of you, each of us, to be able to do that wherever we go. And sometimes it may not feel safe, right?
Right.
And sometimes it does. Socorro.
I was just going to say, I know I shared a comment, maybe with Angie, about not having the anti-racism language. And for me, I feel like probably even more so in our county, we have had conversations about equity for a very long time, and nothing is changing. And we fall back into our old habits. And I feel like at every level, there is an opportunity to push ourselves into a more uncomfortable position to really examine and disrupt the way we've been doing things. And I feel like if we can't use, the very proactive language of being anti-racist now, like when are we ever going to do it? I mean, now more than ever, there is an opening to be part of a very, as people were saying, active change process. And I agree with you completely, Anna, that we do have to, I think it's about unpacking our own stuff as we sit around the table and thinking about how that weighs into our discussions, our assumptions, and what we believe is kind of the baseline, when the baseline really isn't even like a natural baseline. And so for me, it's important that we push ourselves. I mean, if we're not pushing ourselves as a commission, I don't know how we expect others to change. And so I just want us to claim transformative space in this conversation, at least the opening, right? Because just saying anti-racist isn't like the there all be all, but at least it's a step. To fall back now seems like a very weak starting position.
And we have to acknowledge that up until a few years ago, the word racism wasn't widely accepted in our community, right? We felt Absolutely. Like we had to hide to talk about racism, Absolutely. Right? And so here we are today, and the act of being anti-racist or proactively working on anti-racism means that we are accountable to changing our systems, our practices, our values, our belief systems if they are hurtful to others, right? And now we're accountable because if we're not actively doing that, then we're supporting racism, right? It is really as simple as that. There isn't a middle ground. There is no longer, but I can't say it in that meeting because they may think I'm an angry brown woman, right? They may think I'm an angry brown woman. In fact, welcome, right? I know who I am. And I also know that I have people who had to sacrifice their own identities in our community as people of color to be palatable to the white people who were in power. And so that generation is the generation right before me, right? We are not talking about 100 years ago. We are talking about 10 years ago. And so I have a responsibility to show up and show up fully for them and for the generation after me. And so do the rest of us, right? As white allies, we have a responsibility to say to our white colleague who says, well, she's just very difficult, right? Or, oh, that's Socorro, she's very difficult, right? Or, oh, that Oscar, he shouldn't have said something, right? To then say, no, actually, right? They may have a point. That is anti-racism. That is how we're actively working to dismantle belief systems, which, as we will see later in the presentation, is what then creates all of these other structures.
If I could speak, there's just so many things going on in my head. It's hard to put it all down, but there's this, I've been thinking about this a lot over the last year, 2 years actually, is this idea of unconscious bias and just how all of us, it's not one community to the other or the Anglo community or the brown community. I think it's all of us. We believe in ourselves more than anybody. We believe that for the most part, unless you're a complete psychopath, we think we do good things from our experiences, the way we vote, if we recycle, the newspapers we read. And ultimately, our biggest blind spot is our unconscious bias. And that the way that comes across is who we choose to trust more, who we choose to believe more, who we choose to give credit easily. And I think it can come across in our family, just who, we walk across the street and see somebody who's homeless, how we respond to that, all the way to somebody presenting at a board meeting where we might give them more credit and trust than someone else who presents right after them. So I'm not sure where this is going in the long run. I think we just have to examine ourselves just as much as we and be honest with ourselves.
Yes, and Jose, that takes a major investment in our own selves, right? And it takes a major investment from our organizations to build our capacity, right? So it does happen at different levels. And going back to unconscious bias, I also want to acknowledge, right, the fact that what is the number one thing that white people are afraid of being called if they're not actually racist?
Racist.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's also is anybody. It's, to be like when my kids are talking to me and I pull up a point if they're acting a little bit too focused on something, that I'm not woke enough, that I don't know what I'm talking about, like as if I just haven't been there. And I think to assume that a white person doesn't know or doesn't understand is making it too cartoonish.
That's biased in and of itself, Jose, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think we all have to accept, try to be open and not make a decision too quickly.
Exactly.
I want to throw another word in here. I think the other thing that white people are afraid of is being called hypocritical or insincere, because it's very hard to join this conversation when you're doing the very best you can. And the first thing that gets thrown at you is, well, you're just joining the bandwagon, if you will, right now. And when you're leading a group of people, if you happen to be in a position in which there are lots of diversity and opinions and et cetera, like for example, in our staff, these conversations are hard to have, but they're especially hard to have if some of your staff say, well, this isn't appropriate at a workplace. And it's not the people that you think that would be saying that. So you can't, no one size fits all, no one color has the same sort of viewpoint, if you will. And so I think that that's not a word. I don't want to be called a racist, but I also don't want to be called a hypocrite or insincere. And so I think we have to say that out loud, that the reason that a lot of people are quiet is because they don't know how to join the conversation.
Thank you, Michelle. Anyone have a perspective on that?
Well, this is Oscar. I think all of those points are incredibly important. And I look at this statement and, you know, the word power comes to mind. And there's often times that we don't recognize or talk about the importance of power and power dynamics, particularly in the workforce as we're trying to have these challenging conversations. And it is incumbent upon those in power to create that authorizing environment to be able to talk about these issues and create the container that you talk about, Anna, to welcome people so they don't feel like they're late to the game, as Michelle articulated, that unless we create that safe space and allow people to speak their truth wherever they may be along this continuum, I think that gets us a little further, recognizing that you know, we all come from very different lived experiences, but unless we have the kind of container that can hold these very challenging and difficult conversations, and I'm seeing this, people tend to push back or to stay silent or to not engage. So while these conversations are incredibly important, we also need to take a great deal of care in the way in which we craft the container to host and to have these conversations.
And and if we go back to our agreements, right, we have in our agreements that we have to own our privilege, right? We must own our power and privilege. And so what I will say is that we have to be very aware of who is saying we're not ready for this, right? Who is saying this can't happen within our organization? If it's our frontline staff, that probably means, right, that now we have the responsibility as people in leadership to ensure that we're building capacity so that our staff are able to understand why this is not only necessary, but an imperative, right, for their well-being and our own, right? And so the other part to this is it also depends who's calling us a hypocrite, right? And so we have to have the ability to hold on to two seemingly opposing points of view and be able to sit in that, right? And it is true, people of color are going to, by virtue of the fact that they've been violated by this society, have mistrust, right? Our country was founded on violence and the lack of trust. And so that is what is pervasive today. And that is why it's so important to create containers where we're able to have these conversations and where we're each able to own the place in which we stand, our belief systems and our actions. And when we can take a step back when we're being impacted by it and honor the fact that other people may feel differently. And that doesn't then reflect on us as people, whether good or bad. It just means that people are having a reaction to the historical traumatization of people of color, right? Racism hurts everybody. It is not exclusive to people of color. There's much trauma within white communities as well. And so I also want to say, in working toward anti-racism, whiteness will attempt to shift its boundaries to preserve its power and privilege, right? And so when we're having uncomfortable thoughts, when we're feeling defensive against someone, right? And we're in a place of power and privilege, we have to be very aware in the way in which we're utilizing that to shift so that we can still hold power, right? So, Nora, did you want to say something?
I was just going to ask you to say more about that, about the shifting power to hold on to privilege and what that looks like.
I have been doing a lot of reflection around how are the boundaries of whiteness going to shift, right? And I think that one of the things we're seeing is, and I'm going to say it, right? The fact that we have police departments attending protests, right? That doesn't mean that they're changing their systems, right? And so if we're gonna hold hands with you, but not be accountable to the system that has, by virtue of its existence, destroyed communities, right? And then we're gonna be defensive about that, or we're gonna violate you later in the afternoon at the protest, then that's how we're seeing boundaries shift, right? We're seeing like, we are with you, but we're not changing a system, right? And so I think that it happens slowly, quietly, much of the time in backroom deals, right? So I think it's important to be aware of the ways in which we're seeing organizations, right, try and shift to still hold on to power, and to really understand how this all stems from belief systems. And I will say, if in this moment, any of you and anyone who's listening to this is deeply challenged by what I'm saying, that is amazing, because that means that there's a belief that you have the power to shift. And all it takes is taking a seat and being mindful and aware of that, right? So how are we doing? Good?
Good.
Ready to move on to the next thing?
Well, and I just want to underscore what you're saying, Anna. I mean, there's lots of examples, whether it's, voting, voter suppression, passing laws that restrict, make it more difficult for people of color to vote. It's also in the even locally, the local laws that we pass around building and where we build and what gets approved where. I mean, it is all around us, this desire to preserve power. It's also in the way that we make budgetary decisions that, while we may say something and we may print it on a very glossy, pretty brochure to say this is what we are, and yet our decisions reflect an entirely different, story. That also needs to be called out, and we have to have those conversations about why that is happening. So, we are steeped into this, and I think part of our responsibility is to have the courage to begin to say, whatever you're doing or whatever you're saying is not reflective of what you're doing. And that is not just something that we project to others, but it's also something that we have to look at our own work and what we do and how we personally show up to situations. So I'm just very much enjoying the moment of this conversation.
Thank you, Oscar. Anyone else? Jenny Lynn?
I'm with Oscar. I'm very much absorbing and listening and processing right now. It's very helpful conversation.
Thank you. Sakura.
I I appreciate the conversation and believe that if we're not, change is uncomfortable and transformation is equally uncomfortable. And so I find it a necessary prerequisite for a different world. And I loved the word courage, the courage to kind of be out there and personally be taking risks. I mean, it is the ultimate selflessness of understanding power and privilege, right? That if people get called names all the time, and some people have to take it. And like, I don't know, I get called names all the time. And when it's deserved, I'll reflect and change and move forward. But if it's what's necessary to shift conversations and somebody has to say it, I mean, I know I sit in a place of privilege. And so I just think about, for us, particularly on the board, and as I think about my own day job, the question for me is, how do we make visible our blind spots about the institutional racism that is flowing through our systems so that we can address it and change it? And I don't think there's a book, because I've been looking. I don't think there's a book or necessarily a flow chart, but thinking about what are the actions and behaviors that an anti-racist organization takes to change the way they operate in the world. And I do see that as us as individuals, but also the way in which we frame literally every conversation, every investment, and every policy we make, both internally and outward facing. And so as I think, how do we operationalize highfalutin values and ideals to actually be a different type of organization and group of people? And so that's kind of where I'm spending my time thinking. I'm not saying that I have a clear path, but I think that's the next level of work, to be part of a movement. I always think about Oscar and his rhino and the mosquitoes, and that, like, we need to organize our thinking to be different in the world right now.
Thank you, Socorro. Anyone else? Kelly, anyone?
I appreciate Socorro's comments so much, because I think, and I think I mentioned this to you in a previous conversation, but I'm in a space of listening and learning and trying to appreciate the privilege that I bring to the table, and in terms of the perspective that might bring. And I'm still not so much in this conversation, because I feel like I'm sitting in a room with people who think about equity and anti-racism and privilege all day, every day, and a lot of the work that you all do. And then I, bring with it the experience where I, oftentimes I'm in rooms with people where that is not the conversation or the topic, and not because it's not something that needs to be had, a conversation that needs to be had, or a conversation that, isn't going to be had, but because it's just not the work that's being done. And so, to Socorro's point, and almost everything, and I think Angie probably attest to this, and almost everything with First Five that we've done, we've got, Oscar and Socorro and people with incredible vision. And then, I sit here and go, okay, so how do we take that vision? How do we get there? How do we, turn it into action? So I think where I sit is, one, where is it appropriate for me, just from the space that I come from, to insert myself in the conversation? And then two, how do we as First Five actively participate and not just put more jargon and words out there into the world? Because I feel like that is so easy to do. Is how do we actually take the active steps to meet what we say we are?
Thank you, Kelly. And you bring up a great point, which is that we all have a duty to actively participating in the conversation, right? And the more privilege and power we hold, that same equal duty we have to stepping back and allowing the voices of others to be heard, right? And so it's a fine dance of knowing when to actively take space and when to make sure that other people also have the space to speak up, right? And so it's about learning how to hold those containers, because ultimately change really happens within ourselves and our small teams, and that is really how it starts to trickle out into the outskirts of our organizations, right? Some of us have 10 employees, others of us have hundreds and thousands of employees, right? And so it really takes actively living into the values to be able to then inspire that in all of the other people within your organizations and the community.
Comment.
One more comment, Jose.
You know, I like how you mentioned the idea of the power play of the larger organizations, you know, and the shifting power depending on the situation. I think what's more insidious is the individual power play that can happen with colleagues or within the power structure of where we work. We all spend most of our days somewhere else, and those things are happening. It could be, like you had mentioned, Anna, somebody saying, oh, they're just being difficult, or you know, they don't have the right social intelligence, so we don't want to promote her or invite her into this conversation, or Jose, me, into the conversation because they say things that are uncomfortable or not the right way. Well, it's not the right way for a majority of people, but it may be the voice that needs to be heard. And I think that happens, unfortunately, more than it should. But then when it comes to the meeting as a whole for First Five, I wonder how we're going to take this conversation into how we plan for 2027. And that means the sense of if we're taking the current structure of who owns or who is involved, which organizations are involved in certain aspects of the community, is that power structure as equitable as it could be? And I don't know that, but it's something that we have to think about as we're moving forward. And then finally, our own personal response. We're going to get this in the future. I remember when there was early desegregation, and we thought we had fixed it in the early 70s. It's going to happen again. How do we individually respond? I'm curious what you think about that, because it's our own actions to the action that matter. That's a lot.
Thank you, Jose. I can tell you that I do not believe that we will, quote unquote, fix it in my lifetime. And I'm 31 years old, right? So that means that we have a long road ahead of us. And we also have to be okay with that and actively work to continue to transform our communities, right? And so it really starts at home. Alrighty, beautiful. I'm gonna move us along.
Anna, can I just make a final comment to Jose's point? Because I think
Yes.
that what the commission has elevated this year is this idea that we have to engage more in the space of advocacy. Advocacy vis-a-vis how we can either support or make a point to oppose certain policies that further perpetuate a bifurcation of our community along race and class. And so I think what I'd like to see, and this is why we want to look at data where we see disproportionality, is that we call those policies that create that disproportionality and that result in a bifurcation of our community that is clearly along race and class. And you know, we didn't get here overnight. And I understand that the fact that this is going to be a long haul, but I think we have not just a responsibility to our community, but I think we also have a much larger moral responsibility to help address these structures that truly harm and cause violence on the very community that we all stand up and care so deeply about. So I'd like to see us not lose sight of the power of advocacy vis-a-vis what we can do on our commission, even as our revenue is declining.
Thank you. We lost a little bit of that, but I got the spirit of it, Oscar. And so at this point, I also want to fully acknowledge that this space is for full participation. And I'm so sorry that I didn't make this clear to the staff at the beginning of this conversation, right? If you have anything you want to say, it may go, you know, not necessarily in line with what it's usual for your space, but I do want to say by virtue of being in this space, you also are able to, as the facilitator, I am telling you, please, if anything comes up for you, do say it, right? And Angie, I'm gonna hope that that's okay with you.
Of course.
Okay, so let's keep moving. So a lot of us talked about like, how do we actually operationalize this, right? How do we actually create matrix, and how do we actually like figure out how to do this in a way that works? And so in the start to that conversation that I want to offer to all of you is the lens of systemic oppression that was created by the National Equity Project. And we will send you that as a resource after the full package. But if you take a look at this and we go back to our conversation, right, we are talking about individual behavior, individual actions, individual beliefs, right? And then how does that start to connect into the interpersonal, right? The interactions we have with each other, what we deem to be okay to do and not okay to do, right? And then how does that then get into the institutions that we work in and that we run, that we lead? And how do those belief systems, attitudes, interactions then become structural pieces to our institutions? And so if we look at all of that, we see that everything's interconnected, right? We are not separate from the other. And so nothing happens in fragmentation. And so that is one of the biggest lies we've been told, that it is okay to be fragmented. So if we look at this, we really start to understand the ways in which we truly have to work on all levels. And we've also seen that systemic change, policy change, right, creates behavior change, and then creates belief systems change. And we can see that very clearly with the having to wear a seatbelt, right? We see that now as like a core part of our responsibility as drivers to wear a seatbelt, because we're keeping ourselves protected. We're also keeping other people protected, right? So it's important that we understand that we can also change. It's not a one-way street, that it tends to go both ways, that we can create policy and structural change that shifts interpersonal and individual behavior. And similarly, we can shift our individual behavior to then start to create institutional and structural change. And with that, I have a couple of questions for you on that. And it is, how are you digging down to the root causes, whether it's within First Five, within your own organization, within your own belief systems, in a way that can truly inform the ways in which our individual actions lead to systemic inequities? And with that, I'll open the floor for any questions or answers to that question. And maybe I'll start with Angie, since she's been thinking so much about how to get this going.
Well, I think as we've been, in the planning process up to this point, with the strategic planning advisory team, looking at data with, the Quality Counts Consortium, with the Leadership Advisory Roundtable, and then back the whole number of years where we look at disparity data, right? Upstream Investments put out indicator reports for several years that really focused on disparities. The Portrait of Sonoma elevated the tale of two, and yet and people got very passionate, and we get really worked up about this issue and outraged, and yet we haven't really gone to, okay, what are those structural pieces and how can we actually dismantle them? Like, I think that's the conversation that hasn't really happened or hasn't been activated into concrete, movement. So that's what I'm really excited about is what is our role in addressing those structural barriers? We have amazing programs. We have evidence-based and evidence-informed strategies that are proven to effectively target populations that lack opportunity. And yet we're not, the overall issues are getting worse, right? Children are less ready for school than over the 4 years that we've been measuring that. So I'm excited about digging down into the institutional piece and the structural piece. And how could we fund strategies while also working on structures?
I'm going to throw out one of the root causes and get your reactions, which is, are we truly doing equity-driven work, anti-racist-driven work, when organizations that we fund pay a minimum wage to the people that are actually doing the work and that also happen to be the people who are part of these communities, right? And so as funders, we have for a long time to turn a blind eye toward that, right? And so as we really look to dig into the root causes, what does it mean? How are we holding organizations accountable who are exploiting, right, the knowledge and wisdom of these communities to only turn around and pay the minimum wage so that they can't necessarily survive in this county?
Right, and those wages are paid through contracts with First Five, which we sign off on, right? We don't question. It's just that's what the prevailing wage for that role is. So I think we're complicit. Yeah.
And I think that that's a really interesting question from my perspective. It's something I, as a nonprofit provider, it's been challenging over the years. You get a contract 6-7 years ago and the contract doesn't grow as the cost of living grows. And so as nonprofits, you struggle to continue to meet the deliverables with, the need to increase wages, the need to deal with higher cost of goods. And so that's part of the institutional piece that really, I think, needs to be challenged at a funder level and a lot of different levels. So I think that's a very interesting question to really wrestle with as primarily a funding organization, and maybe lead that work for others, because it can't just be one funder, right? That's where it has to be a system change, because it continues to disempower people.
Thanks, Jenny Lynn. Nora and then Kelly.
Thanks. One of the things that comes up for me is thinking about, root cause analysis, which is, I think, just a fancy way of asking why for a long time. And I think that that's so important. I was part of our county's GARE cohort, now our SoCo Real group focused on racial equity. And, one of the really glaring gaps in our ability to do root cause analysis is who's at the table answering the question why, right? And so if you have a lot of individuals who have kind of come up within the system, that's kind of, a white majority culture created system asking the why questions, you're just not going to get to some of the, frankly, the right answers. And I think, to the extent that we're making sure that our tables are inclusive of folks who are on the ground experiencing the programs and the institutions that we're running are part of that question, I do think we get a lot closer. And I know this group is a little bit aware of it, and Anna and I are part of this. Anna is part of, and I'm staff to this Latinx health work group that the department is running, and in our COVID, as part of our COVID response, to kind of bring in expertise that the department frankly doesn't have around how we better mitigate and stop the disparity that we're seeing in terms of the positivity rate in the Latinx community here. And I don't want to hold it up as, an example of the way we always do things. It's definitely different and fresh. And I'm having, Latinx community members and leaders at the table helping to do that root cause analysis. I have just seen our response shift so much more quickly than if we just had department leadership sit around a table kind of trying to speculate about why we're seeing some of the things that we're seeing. And our approach has just really broadened, I think, to thinking not just about what the department can do, right, but what are the other levers in the community that we need to pull to help make sure we're addressing some of the issues. For example, right, we talk a lot about why folks in the Latinx community are having challenges sheltering in place or meeting a quarantine or an isolation order. And part of it is the fear of the why, the root cause there gets to, a fear around loss of income. And so being able to partner with folks in the community who can help provide guidance to individuals and employers around sick leave protections is part of like the complete package that the department and this work group can put forward to help support the community. So just a small example, but again, just if we don't have the right voices at the table, the root cause analysis, isn't gonna be helpful.
And Nora, I would say that the learning goes back and forth, right? Like the learning, the staff are learning a lot, and it also takes the flexibility to say, I want to learn and I want to learn how to do it better. And much of the time in government, that isn't necessarily a value, right? The value brought to government a lot of the time for individuals is this idea of meritocracy or expertise, this idea that you're supposed to know it all. And so to have the openness and the leadership to say, we don't know it all, we want to learn, and also for people who are in this work group to understand how the systems within the county work, right? So that's what really creates this space to learn on both sides and to be able to mobilize and shift things as necessary for the well-being of the community. Kelly?
I don't remember originally what my thought was, but just based off of what Nora just said, I also question if the conversations are happening in all of the right places. We talked about the shift to wanting to do advocacy work, and no offense to anybody sitting on the commission, but oftentimes people walk into meetings to talk about a slightly different issue, and it's the same faces around the table, because there's incredibly passionate, wonderful, smart people in our community that want to make change. And there's also a lot of incredibly compassionate, smart people who are not in this work day to day. They're running their businesses. They're the employers that are, and who you alluded to, are not, maybe paying a living wage and are contributing to the problem of systemic inequity and racism. And I don't think it's that there's I hesitate to say that they're that they don't want to come to the table, but it's that it's not part of what they do every day. Mm-hmm. And it's not part of it's they don't know how to quite plug into the conversation or be a part of the conversation. And I just, when we talk about the advocacy work that we do and the comment about, is it helping lead other funders into this conversation? I think it's really important to think about, who is not part of the conversation that is helping be a big part of the issue at hand, and how do we welcome them into the fold to be part of that conversation and help make change. And I think the root cause is incredibly important. And Nora, I actually need to follow up with you on that, because I have employers coming to me that are employing the same people that are the people that are afraid of losing income, and they don't know what to do, and they need to know how to better communicate with their employees. And so just thinking about the work that we do as First Five and as a funder, and how do we dismantle the systems that Angie was talking about? Well, who has not been part of that conversation that can help dismantle those systems, that has contributed maybe unknowingly to the systems that we're in? and maybe could help dismantle them. And it's so incredibly hard to bring new faces into the table, to the table that maybe have not traditionally been part of the conversation and are not going to come with all of the right words or jargon, and they're also going to come with an incredibly different perspective. But I think that they have to be at the table in order to make a change. And it's going to be the same folks, the same way that Nora was just saying, we need to have the people that can answer that root cause of why. We also need to have the people that can help dismantle those systems that have helped create them, maybe unknowingly. And until we are able to have that conversation, I truly don't think that we're going to be able to dismantle anything.
And so I'm gonna move us on. Thank you, Kelly. I will say that some of those conversations seems like they're happening, especially in the agricultural world, right? And so it's about how do we then create models for more conversations to be happening. And I will take this opportunity to say that this is not a blame game, right? This is not about who's at fault and who isn't. This is about how are we going to move forward together to create the change we need in our community so that our children are able to live healthy, full, thriving lives, right? And can do whatever they want in this world, regardless of where they come from. So I'm going to move us on. Thank you, everyone. Angie, next. And so this gets me to social justice leadership. And so just hang in there. Social justice is not a dirty term. It's a wonderful term by virtue of what we're talking about. We are actually talking about social justice, right? We are talking about bringing justice to all the people who have been violated throughout history by virtue of the color of their skin, their income status, right? So it is about figuring out how are we as individuals, right, acting and leading in a way that moves us towards social justice, that moves us toward those equity pieces that we're talking about, toward anti-racism, toward belonging. And I will say that I don't use the word inclusion. Inclusion means that only a few of us get invited to the party. Inclusion is what happened to the generation before me, who had to then play gatekeepers for the rest of us because they didn't want to lose their spot. Right? Belonging is the space where we all get to show up fully and get to do whatever it is that we want to do and dream up the world that we want to dream up in this space, right? So I want to encourage you to take a look at your type of leadership and see how it is aligned with social justice leadership, right? This could be a whole other training that Angie does for you. I'm going to move us on to the last slide. And Angie laughs. I'm very aware that it seems like I'm bringing you a lot more work than maybe you thought you were going to have. The last one is, what do you need in order to build communities of belonging? And I want you to take a look at this graphic. I want you to take a look at what it means to be in true community, right? What it means to celebrate who we are and what we bring to the table. And I will tell you that this graphic was designed by a kick-ass young woman of color who went to school to be a graphic designer. And when I couldn't find a graphic that truly spoke to community in the way that I envisioned it in my head, I called her up and said, can you do something that truly inspires change? And she came up with this beautiful rendition of what it means to truly be in a space of belonging. And so I want to encourage you to really think about that is a system, right? It's an action, right? When we don't find the things that we're looking for, are we employing and are we paying people who understand these values to then create renditions of what they see that we could be, right? And are we living to that full potential? So we are at the end of our time. I will take any final comments, questions, thoughts, and then I will close us out.
Actually, Anna, I just had a little text with Oscar on the side, and we think it would actually be more productive to stick with this and work on the statement so we can move that forward. And
Okay.
Then if everybody's okay, we can punt the discussion of the strategies to the August commission meeting. Folks okay with that? Just feels that like we are that's really, really productive.
Awesome. So then let's answer the question, because I think that'll help us look into the statement, right? And start to really draft the statement that we want to live into. So once again, the question is, what do you need in order to build communities of belonging?
If I can, I mean, I think what.
This is Oscar.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Michelle.
I was going to say what Socorro said about operationalizing some of this
No,
and the right questions to be asking. Those are, I think, is one of the things that I would need, because as an agency that has focused on the disability community for a very long time, for us, inclusion means a really different thing, but it means basically the same thing about belonging. So it'd be really nice to have a set of questions or a set of ways of operationalizing some of what we've been thinking about. An example of that would be when we were thinking about who is not on our staff, we asked ourselves, why was that? And the answer that came up was where we were recruiting staff members, not that folks in different communities weren't interested in working with children with disabilities. And so we had to change how we were reaching into communities recruiting. And that's a change that's coming, but it was a while for us to get there. So we employed a system of the question behind the question. Like, what's the right question we should be asking? And so I think that would be amazing if there were more ways of operationalizing some of this.
And that is the work, Michelle, right? The work is to figure out, how do we operationalize this? What are the metrics that we need to use in order to truly measure the essence of these terms, right? Of how do we turn all of this beautiful, fluffy language that makes us feel amazing into actual actions?
Yeah.
And so I will tell you that that is work that is being done, but that we are all kind of at the forefront of really starting to create this operating principles for this type of work.
This is Oscar. I recognize that my internet may be unstable, just as I may be at times, but I
Everyone says that, Oscar. You're funny.
wanted a couple things. I think it's important. Yeah, I think it's important that we recognize our work as part of a much larger ecosystem, because when we think about well-being, we focus on the early end. But children are part of families, and families have needs. And families live in communities, and those communities have needs. So as I think about, what do we hope and want for our children? It's not just about what we want for them in the immediate term, but what do we want them to be? Where do we want them to experience community 10, 20 years down the road? So while our work is incredibly important, we have to talk about those larger macro systems that influence what we do. Just as Anna, you brought up the issue of minimum wage. We know that wage is so linked to well-being, and there's a strong health-wealth connection there. So we have to take into consideration those larger factors, but understand, what can we do with our sphere to influence the larger whole? Sometimes we don't do that because we get so myopic in what we do. And so it's important that we understand where we are situated and what role are we playing for the long-term well-being of our community. And I probably froze, right?
You did. We missed all of that, Oscar. It was so choppy. I'm not sure I even got one sentence out of that.
Summarize.
I'm sure it was
possibly?
brilliant.
Got it?
I am sure it was brilliant, but
I'll type my stuff.
Can I try to summarize? Is that we just need to really think about everything that's been said from the bias point of view, from leadership point of view, from who we pick at the table for the long-term health of our community. And I think it's true. I really do think that, we have to take risks in terms of who we listen to and who we might fund in the future. And because inclusion is sometimes getting out of the comfort zone of what we know is normal and what we are used to. And I would love to see that happen.
Thank you, Jose.
I'm still thinking about this question, Anna, and maybe jumping, ahead. I'm a data person, so jumping ahead to how do you measure this? But it's also a question, it's a conversation that I had with somebody recently, right? And not to, pick on standardized tests and things like that, because there is value in that. But I think we also need to think about, defining metrics that value this, right? So when you have, for example, somebody, choosing between two schools for their child to go to, and one of them has a certain set of test scores and the other doesn't, is there a complementary metric that is more about the community of that school, the culture there, the diversity of that community, right? So that people have, we by assigning only certain metrics to some of these things, I think we sometimes inadvertently shift the value, right, in one direction. And I think we have to think of ways to kind of define and measure these other pieces that we value and that we want to hold up. So I don't have an answer for what the metric is, but I think that's one way that we think about it too as we start to operationalize, right? We have to think about ways to capture this and to understand how we're moving the needle, but also to say this is important to us enough to measure and to hold up, as part of the equation of how we're advancing or how we're moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Nora. So Angie, I think let's go to the statement and read it, and then we'll come back to the question.
Want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Can you, oh,
First Five Sonoma County believes that equity is just and fair inclusion in a community and society where everyone can fully and safely participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, regardless of their race, where they live, immigration status, their family's economic status, or any other defining characteristic. Many children, 0 to 5, families, and communities experience disparate opportunities due to historic patterns of exclusion based on race, immigration status, and multi-generational poverty, among others. First Five Sonoma County operationalizes equity by focusing programs and investments on the people and places in our county that face the greatest barriers. We are committed to actively advocating and promoting public policy that seeks to create safe and equitable communities. We take an active role in eradicating poverty and inequity as a means to achieving the mandate of First Five, that all children in Sonoma County are born healthy, develop optimally, and reach their full potential. We are building capacity to more fully understand cultural responsiveness in order to integrate and weave into the fabric of First Five values, ideas, and practices key to the families we serve. This requires the strategic and creative use of our investments, programs, partnerships, engagement with parents and communities, and advocacy for policy and systems change. That's a mouthful.
That is a changing the world statement, Angie.
But also, just to, we haven't actually explicitly stated this. The goal is, or one of the intermediate goals, is to build out an actual framework that takes a statement and operationalizes how are we going to do this in our organizational practices, in our funding practices, in how we support and build the capacity in our community-based organizations. So, and how do we measure that, right? So that's the kind of the longer term, bigger work. So we don't have to pack everything into this statement.
And it is my understanding that you want to create a living, breathing statement that everyone is acting upon.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we can, are we good with that? I know that you guys had a chance to review this. So if we go back to the slide on community, then we can start to dive into what are some other things you would like to see reflected. And maybe we can also just talk about what does this bring up for you? What challenges do you see in you being able to live and breathe this commitment, right, yourself? Because that's really the intention, that you will not just say, yes, we're doing this as the First Five Commission, but how are you then moving this into your own spaces?
Anna, this is Oscar.
Yes, Oscar.
Hopefully I shut my video at the advice of Nora, who said that might be causing my problem. But I, as I hear you talk and as I read this statement, I'm thinking about sort of what is that statement lens, right? As we look at our investments, can we say, does this address some of the structural barriers? Does this meet the needs of our highest, does this serve our hardest served community? So maybe we can start to craft the lens by which we can run all of our investments through to make sure that we're on target.
Thank you, Oscar. And we could really hear you this time.
Much better.
I'll stay dark then.
We'll miss your face.
Or maybe turn your face on when you're not talking.
So Cora misses it too much. Come back. Alrighty, do I start calling on you? Do you volunteer yourselves? What do we want to do here?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Who is the audience for this? Is it us as commissioners? Is it the public? I think that would help me be more clear on my feedback. I don't have any, I think the content is really good. I also wonder if we want something that isn't, it's not a tongue twister, but it is a mouthful. Is there something that's just a little bit more succinct that really drives at the core of what we're getting at, and that also might be more accessible to a kind of a broader audience? So that was one thought. And then the other thought, and I think this goes to Socorro's earlier comments, was, we mentioned race a couple of times in the first paragraph, but I'm not sure we mention it in the second paragraph. So we talk about inequity, but I think we should be really explicit about that. And whether that's naming anti-racism or not, it probably is its own discussion. Anyway, I think we should be bold. I think we should use words that we're not seeing other places to elevate the discussion and to normalize these conversations and to set an example. And I think we should, just think about who is going to be receiving this and kind of level of clarity we want to achieve versus, a roadmap.
Angie, did we reach any final language around anti-racism for this statement?
Mm-mm. No, I didn't edit it after the emailed input that I got. Just thought we would revisit that. We'd talk about that today.
I wonder if it can be a little, I'm trying to think about all my own communication because I'm wordy in and of myself. So I say this looking into the mirror, but language that is just, so Sonoma County, First Five Sonoma County believes in a community, like get rid of the blah, blah, blah about equity, just, fair, inclusion. Believes that we must, live in a community and society where blah, this, and I don't know if those are the right words, but just not we believe this so that, but we believe this, and therefore equity is an ongoing value and internal strategy that will be, or something like that. But this is what we believe in, and it's a necessity for our community to thrive. And like, I like kind of this is how it looks, but it does seem like we are languishing in a lot of words.
Yep.
Can I, at the risk of talking too much, can I just say one quick thing about the word belief? I saw something recently that struck home with me about, you know, we've probably all seen those yard signs that say, like, in this family, we believe Black Lives Matter, and it's a list of things. And I saw this critique of that, right, that is accepting those things as beliefs and not fact. And so I would just, if there's another word we could use besides belief, because I think it might perpetuate, you know, the idea that there's an alternative to this when there isn't.
Right.
Can I add a little something to it too? Is that I find myself a little bit, I've seen so many company documents along the way of a statement that almost resolves people of continuing to evolve and sort of like, we've arrived, we're there, this is how we are, and therefore in our organization, we would never have bias, we would never have racism because we put out the statement. So what I would love to see is this being somewhat of a living document, and I don't know how you can put it in the wording, but something that we will continue to grow as the challenges evolve in the future. We will, you know, something in that sense of saying, you know, we're gonna keep doing this even when the world changes. So that's, I don't know how to put that in nicely, but we didn't fix this, but we're just gonna work on it as best we can.
Michelle, do you want to expand on what you said in the chat?
I just was thinking that as I listened to some of these questions or assumptions, for example, paying line staff minimum wage is not a question that anybody has ever asked me when I've applied for a grant. We turn in a budget, you know, that kind of thing, but nobody, and so to assume, first off, there are a lot of drivers to that, including that children have never been honored, and the people who work and take care of our children are not honored financially in that way, which is another layer to all of this. But no one's ever asked me actually sort of what's the division between line staff and supervisors, et cetera, et cetera. So that just struck me. So as I think about it, and I think about as a commission, what questions would we like answered about opportunities for movement? How do you elevate? How do you recruit staff? And not just require an equity statement from the folks that we're going to fund, because I think at this point, almost every agency in Sonoma County has crafted an equity statement. And as been said over and over again, operationalizing those statements is what we as a commission, I think, would be looking for. And I like change the world statements. I think you reach for the stars as much as you possibly can.
Thank you, Michelle. Anyone else? Who are my quiet people? Jenny Lynn, Kelly. I know that Renee also had a thing on the chat if you want to say it out loud and proud.
I'd have to go back and read it, but I was just saying, first, I think it takes the commitment of all of our time, energy, and resources that it would take to drive into the root issues and how to dismantle them. This includes starting with a framework for our staff, commissioners, and our organizations, but really starting internally to build out. And even if this looks in the long run like, you know, if we are requiring organizations to pay staff better or have a different kind of structure that is based on anti-racism and equity and really putting more quality into the families of the people who are employed by the organizations, then maybe we should, like Nora mentioned, measure things different. Maybe we should be looking at what's the quality of life that is improved by the people employed by our organizations, and how does that outweigh possibly being able to serve less children with that program to counteract and serve the families of the staff members better. Because from me, I was thinking, well, gosh, you know, when I started working certain places, my kids still needed all these services. So even though I was going through this process and learning all of these things, it was like my kids were still stuck in this state of all of these issues that I couldn't help because of what I was making. And so it would be a transition, and to look at how are we making the best and most powerful difference and what means the most in our community. And really, we'd have to be really honest and think that that might mean serving less kids with our programs because they're going to cost more.
Thank you, Renee. Kelly, Jenny Lynn. Are you guys going to be able to live with the statement based on what others have said?
Yeah, I agree. It's very long, and as with everything else, I'm interested in how it will be applied to our work moving forward. Yeah, I think that what it says is incredibly important. But if there's a way to, I guess before I even say that, I agree with the statement. I think I want to know really who is the audience, who is it meant for?
So I can address that.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, the equity statement it's going to be part of our strategic plan. So it's the same audience as the strategic plan, right? The stakeholders of First Five. So that includes organizational stakeholders, people that may or may not be funded by us, but serve children birth to 5 and their families. It includes parents, elected officials, you know, our business community partners, anyone who has a stake in what First Five does with our revenue in the community is part of that audience.
So
Thank
I
you,
think
Angie.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I think with that statement, there's a way to capture everything that's here a little bit more succinctly, given that that's the audience. And then I think back to like, what are the conversations we're not having and who needs to see this? And if we can just get it a little bit shorter, that would be great. But I don't want to also take away from what's in there, because I think it's important.
So Moira did a little bit of quick wordsmithing, and also, you know, we want you guys to know that the commitment is to come back with a statement that incorporates all of this extremely valuable input, right? So something that's more direct, more, I like the word bold, stronger, more succinct language. And so she did a quick wordsmithing. Oh, and also translated into Spanish and making sure that it means the same thing, right, when it's translated. So her new paragraph is, First Five Sonoma County commits to building a community and society where everyone can fully and safely participate, regardless of their race, where they live, immigration status, their family's economic status, or any other defining characteristic. Children 0 to 5, families and communities should not be excluded from opportunity based on race, immigration status, and multi-generational poverty, among others. We will work to dismantle racism in our own operations and partner with organizations that are also able to commit to anti-racism. So just an example of kind of honing it down and being more direct and pulling some of the sort of verbiage that isn't necessary.
And Angie, I know it's not for today, this is Moira, but we also, you did an extraordinary job starting to think through like a framework that we could look at, you know, at a future meeting that sort of would show how this would show up in funding practices, partnership practices, all of that work, I think is going to be really helpful. But it was good to start with the language and the framing and the placing of ourselves in this work first, and then come back to the commission with that framework will be really, I think, really useful for folks.
Yeah, and so that is the recommendation for today and for this item, is that we're going to go to approve this draft language and refining the statement based on the input, and then bringing that back. We can bring it back in August, and when we do the item around reviewing the strategies, so that you could then hopefully approve the actual statement, and then from there build out the framework that would support, it would be actually part of the strategic plan. I mean, the more integrated it can be with what strategies are we going to fund and how are we going to fund them, it really does create the sort of structure for how we fund.
Angie, this is Oscar. Will you be sending this statement out? I'm thinking about sort of the operationalizing aspect and what the metrics could be. So it might be good for us to start thinking about that. You know, that if this is what we say,
yep,
what will we look to as an indicator of us, you know, impacting that particular area?
Right. Yeah, I will absolutely. I actually have a draft. It's very, very drafty, but I can send out the draft framework so you can see kind of what we're thinking of in terms of how that's built. It's kind of logic model-y, you know, sort of what are we trying to address? What are the levers we need to push? What does this look like in our kind of internally in the organization? What does it look like in our funding? How does this get integrated into kind of our overall activities? And then how do we measure that?
And so Cora posted some stuff on the chat as well. Angie, what's our end time?
11.
Okay. So for whoever's taking notes and bring all this back to, so that you know that it's there.
Yep.
So with that, I'm gonna close out my piece of this. I wanna say thank you so much. It has been truly an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all. I hope that you found this in some ways helpful, and that this was able to clarify for you ways to move forward with the work of anti-racism. And I will close it by asking that we each do a one word about how we're in this moment. So I will start and I will say grateful.
Thank you so much, Anna.
I'll say I'm humbled.
Thank you, Oscar.
Hopeful.
Yeah. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Inspired.
Thank you, Nora.
I would say motivated.
Thank you, Genuine. Michelle, Kelly.
Excited.
Thank you, Kelly.
Anxious.
Thank you, Michelle. Natalie, Renee.
I would say discovery.
Thank you. Sakia.
I would say empowered.
Thank you. Natalie.
Excited.
Sandra.
Hopeful.
Moira.
Heartened.
Angie.
Oh, optimistic.
Thank you.
And say overwhelmed.
I know that's
In a
silent.
good way.
So I invite you all to sit with where you are in this moment, and thank you so much. I pass it back to Angie.
Yeah, and Anna, just really quick, on behalf of the commission, I just want to thank you for bringing a very heartfelt discussion to the group, and I really appreciated your candor and the way that you communicated this work to us. So thank you, and it's so great to see you doing this work.
Thank you, Oscar.
And we'll be continuing to work with Anna around building out that framework and operationalizing between now and the end of the calendar year. So I'll pass it to you, Oscar, as the chair, to adjourn the meeting.
Great. Thank you again. And Angie and team, I just want to thank all of you for being so thoughtful in the way that you brought this item to us. And I know this was an important discussion, and I'm glad that we actually took the time to get the full input of the commission. You know, we only get a small opportunity to get it right, and I so appreciate everybody, you know, leaning in and beginning to embrace not only the language that we want to use, but to sort of push us to actually make those words actionable. So thank you so much. And with that, if there are no more questions, we will go ahead and adjourn. But before I do that, I know that we had some folks, the attendees, and I wanted to see if they had any questions or if they wanted to give any feedback via the chat or Q&A. Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and adjourn. Thank you all so much and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.